Last month on a TV show called The Good Fight, a character started monologuing about how it's good to use violence to, quote, enforce Overton's window. The idea being that if people are engaging in speech outside of what is publicly acceptable, you will beat them to enforce what is publicly acceptable. One of the biggest issues with this is that what is or isn't publicly acceptable varies from time to time. There was a long time ago, being gay wasn't publicly acceptable. And it is wrong to physically attack someone for doing something or believing something or living a way that you don't like. It's called liberty. And you can't use force to impose your will on others. Today, we're going to be talking about the duplicitous nature of the left, how they simultaneously argue that speech is or isn't violence, that silence is simultaneously violence, and how they're actively encouraging violence. And there's some really interesting things I've sort of noticed. That at this Huffington Post, with this Huffington Post article, they say, conservatives are upset. The Good Fight wants you to punch Nazis. Interesting. He's saying that conservatives are upset because they don't want the political space to turn into a violent space. Over here at Talking Points Memo, they claim that it's the fascists trying to push society from voting to violence. It makes you wonder then, because maybe we now see the mask slip. It is not conservatives who are trying to bring about a violent fascist paramilitary state. It's Antifa marching through the streets beating people, and it's people on the left like Andy Campbell at Huffington Post who are upset that people are trying to de-escalate the violent tensions. Now, before we get into all this, make sure you go to timcast.com/donate if you'd like to support my work. I really do rely on the support of all of you. Summer months can get really bad with viewership, so there's a monthly donation option, a cryptocurrency option, a physical address, but of course, you can always just share this video and click the like button to tell YouTube it's a good video and that other people should watch it as well. First, we'll go briefly through this story from the Huffington Post. I don't want to go too in-depth. Now, Andy Campbell is an activist. He's very overtly far left. In some instances, he's exaggerated, or my understanding, he's produced overt fake news about like the gaming industry. I don't want to get into his history because it's not about him. It's about the idea being pushed by websites like Huffington Post. There's a reason why people say it's not good to punch Nazis. The real issue is it's not good to punch them unprovoked. Certainly, if someone attacks you, defend yourself. If these people are actually showing up and engaging in riotous behavior, then yes, we should have the police come in and stop this from happening. However, the issue started, the narrative, because Richard Spencer was standing on a street corner giving an interview and someone punched him. We then saw a wave of mainstream left-wing publications cheering this on. In fact, YouTube got involved. This is a video from Akilah Hughes, also known as Akilah, obviously. I briefly worked with her in some capacity when I was at Fusion, although we didn't really overlap because she does comedy and I do politics and news. Here we have a video from her from February 18th, 2017. It says, "Always punch Nazis. This shouldn't be news." Akilah, obviously. However, while some people who are uninitiated or, don't pay attention to politics might hear this and say, well, yes, of course, these are bad people. She says, the same goes for anyone else thinking their hate speech should be protected. That goes for the majority of Americans. She is saying that anybody who believes hate speech should be protected should be punched. They should be prepared to get hit, she says. This is mainstream. This is a verified YouTube account calling for political violence against anyone who believes in true free speech. This includes Ricky Gervais, the comedian who recently tweeted that if you don't believe in free speech for even the most repugnant ideas, you don't believe in free speech. Akilah Hughes is absolutely saying he should be prepared to be hit. One of the things I often highlight is George Carlin, who has numerous offensive segments. It's one of his most famous bits, the 7 words you can't say on TV, but he also has segments about assault and racism where he uses almost every slur you can think of. And that's George Carlin. People say, remember when the left was liberal? Well, let's go here to this Talking Points Memo article. This article was written in response to the idea of punching Nazis. It concludes by saying that pushing civil society from talk and voting to violence and paramilitaries is what the fascists are trying to accomplish, moving from the rule of law to the rule of force. Interestingly, it sounds like this article is actually implying that the left are the real fascists, which I don't believe is fair to say, actually, because fascism implies some kind of nationalism. They're definitely authoritarians. And yes, we can show some examples. The mainstream left is trying to move the arena from speech and voting into violence. First, the obvious, the show from The Good Fight, where he actually says you need to use violence to enforce Overton's window. Again, I'm going to stress, there was a period where interracial dating was not considered publicly acceptable. My family faced the brunt of that and were forced to flee from state to state because it was actually illegal. I would never encourage anyone to engage in violence to enforce Overton's window when you think about the history of this nation and the great things we fought to overcome. This is a terrifying fascistic ideology. But let's move on. Burger King UK, they tweeted just the other day, "Dear people of Scotland, we're selling milkshakes all weekend. Have fun. Love BK, just saying." Now, you may be asking yourself, what does this have to do with anything? What does Burger King telling people they're selling milkshakes have to do with anything? It has to do with the fact that the police requested restaurants, including McDonald's, to not sell milkshakes because people are using them as projectiles. They're buying milkshakes to throw at people. Most notably is Carl Benjamin, who was recently hit with a milkshake. Now, he's been hit with several. This is the left trying to move the political space into the arena of violence. It was not Carl Benjamin advocating for physical conflict or confrontation. He's advocating people come out, speak, and vote. Yet we saw from Talking Points memo, it's the fascists who are trying to move from talking and voting to violence. Again, it would seem it's the left who are advocating for fascism. Burger King then had to clarify, saying, "We would never endorse violence or wasting our delicious milkshakes, so enjoy the weekend and please drink responsibly, people." This tweet was in response to the police saying, please don't do this. Burger King flew in the face of the request. Not only that, but Burger King actually liked several tweets from Antifa activists, or people calling them Antifa and encouraging this behavior. You may say, milkshakes are silly, and it's funny. In fact, one former Vice reporter called it comedy. But it doesn't end with comedy. I responded, it's weird to see so many former Vice people radicalized to the authoritarian left, especially considering Vice's history. Vice is not historically far left. Vice, when I worked there, had a pretty serious problem with not being woke. In fact, they had numerous lawsuits against them recently, which we won't get into. But to see someone from Vice cheering on the escalation of violence, moving from speech and voting into violence, his response was, it's a joke. Carl will understand. My response to him was, telling an offensive joke, albeit one far less offensive than George Carlin had told, is different from throwing things at people. This is radicalization. Normal people do not want fighting and violence. We've already seen fights breaking out and bricks being thrown. And yes, regardless of your opinion on what's going on with Vote Tommy for MEP, we did see a large crowd of people show up to one of his events, and they were throwing bricks, bottles, they were fighting. The tensions escalated. It started with milkshakes, and it ended with bricks. Henry Langston responded with, yes, it's different, as in the milkshaking is funny. But what Carl Benjamin said is in no way funny whatsoever, because he's trying to make light of assault. Glad I could clarify that for you. My response? Escalating violence isn't funny. I don't find assault jokes funny. I'm trying to be light on the language for the podcast. Two things can be true at the same time. I recognize that George Carlin made a lot of these jokes in the past. I also recognize that as a society we change, and sometimes we think some things shouldn't be acceptable. I personally don't find them overly humorous, but I also don't think people should be silenced, especially considering George Carlin was a pioneer in fighting censorship. Henry Langston said, I'm not pushing for violent escalation. I'm finding it hilarious to watch Carl get milkshaked. It's not surprising you're finding this so difficult. But to imply that moving from speech into acts of physical violence is comedy would be to encourage it. And interestingly, yes, we've seen many more Vice employees do this. But let's talk about the idea of speech, because one of the important things about what happened to Carl Benjamin is that one of the protesters who apparently showed up had this to say, that assault jokes equals violence. One of the things we often hear from many people on the far left is that speech is violence. In fact, there are articles from the New York Times saying real speech can cause real harm, anxiety, stress, so it is violence, is it not? Well, not really. But before we move into the contradiction of the left and how they're encouraging, let me say this. These activists have no defining principles. They will weaponize whatever they can to win. I, as an individual, me personally, I have principles. I believe in fairness. I believe in care. I believe in liberty. Those are my strongest moral foundations. But these people don't have particular moral foundations. They just want to win for their tribe. You can't simultaneously say that speech is violence. Here we have another image saying speech is violence, but then also claim that white silence is violence. What they're basically saying is, if you speak ill of us, it's violence, and if you don't say what we want you to say, it's also violence. Quite literally, say what we want to say or else. And of course, you know what the direct response is, that you will be punched, because you should be prepared to get hit. The same goes for anyone else thinking their hate speech should be protected. If you do not agree with them, you are violent, and they will attack you. It is not the right. It is not the conservatives. So when people ask me why I'm so concerned with the left, I think it's plain as day. Here we have a study from the Cato Institute, the state of free speech and tolerance in America. And what may be one of the more shocking findings is that there's actually a decent amount of people in this country that say it's more, liberals, only half of them say it's morally acceptable to punch Nazis. Again, it's not an issue of punching Nazis. It's the shift in the Overton window, and it's the shift in who gets called that word. The number that I find most alarming in this is that 40% think government should prevent hate speech in public. The number's shifting. That's a lot of people in this country who think the government should regulate hate speech, but they can't. We have a First Amendment, and hate speech is clearly an opinion. And this shows how dangerous the rhetoric is becoming. This is a Cato study from 2017. If we don't push back on this, then it's going to be lost. And we're already seeing tensions escalating to violent confrontation in the UK. Once again, it's the left doing this, not the right. I will stress, there are absolutely individuals on the fringe far right, but these are disparate groups of random individuals who tend to act as lone wolves. When it comes to the left, you have a CBS television show, you have Burger King, you have high-profile news outlets and personalities, journalists, all advocating for the escalation of violent conflict. We have this story from the Washington Post claiming that online hate turns into real-life violence. Well, it's not completely untrue. You know, people can be radicalized. In fact, we've seen some pretty crazy individuals become radicalized online. But we're not seeing mainstream support for it. We're seeing mainstream condemnation. Conservatives and liberals alike will condemn this behavior. When it comes to violence from the left in the streets with bricks, bottles, milkshakes, whatever it might be, we see the story often ignored. There was an individual in Portland who clubbed someone over the head with a bike lock for having an American flag. It was a Bernie voter who got hit. Where was the mass condemnation from the left? They ignore it. They ignore these stories, they cheer it on, and they contradict themselves. Is speech violence or isn't it? Well, here's the thing. This is a woman who's claiming that jokes are violence. This is I'll give you another bit of evidence of there being no principles among the left. They're simply a tribe who seeks to win. It's funny how Bill Maher says the conservatives just want to own the libs. Sure, that's true for some people. But you have activists out in the streets saying jokes are violence. And then when Mark Pitkovich of the Anti-Defamation League says anarchist violence against a law office in Portland, someone responds, violence? No, it's vandalism. Violence is a big stretch. Pitkovich said damaging property is a violent act. Here we can see that there is not a defining principle here. I will give respect to Mark Pitkovich, who what I would say is aligned with the left, working for the Anti-Defamation League, recognizing, yes, vandalism is violence. How can you simultaneously have activists on the left claiming that jokes are violence, but that destroying property, burning down churches, etc. are not violence? They claim that smashing windows and setting fires is not violence, but that jokes are violence. How does that make sense? One is a physical act of destruction, and one is you saying a mean word. I gotta stress one more time. This video from Aquila is somebody who has been promoted by high-profile personalities like the Green brothers. One of her biggest videos was promoted, my understanding, I believe it was John or Hank Green. They're big YouTubers, they're big mainstream personalities. But also, she speaks at VidCon, the biggest video convention in the world, is my understanding, for online digital video. And she's been promoted by YouTube specifically. She says, the same goes for anyone else thinking their hate speech should be protected. That includes someone like George Carlin. George Carlin, rest his soul. Then we get to where we are today. Just recently we heard one of Bill Maher's guests said that Trump deserves what Khashoggi got from the Saudis. The mainstream left has been normalizing calls for violence. Kathy Griffin showing a severed head of the president. a guest on Bill Maher saying that Trump deserves what Khashoggi got. Khashoggi was killed. The audience cheered and clapped for this. I don't see mainstream conservatives advocating for this behavior. Not at all. There are certainly fringe weirdos. There's a big difference between some random person on the internet who's saying stupid things on some stupid website and someone appearing on the Bill Maher, Real Time with Bill Maher, a mainstream live HBO program, and having an audience cheer for violence. Let me throw it back to Talking Points memo. Pushing civil society from talk and voting to violence and paramilitaries is what the fascists are trying to accomplish. So what would you call Antifa? And what would you call this from Fran Lebowitz? Now, she did apologize later in the show, but it was because pushback. People on social media were heavily criticizing her. We can then see where the escalation takes us. Anarchist threat emerges across Europe. Parcel bomb sent to French and German officials. I absolutely do not want to downplay the threat of the fringe far right. I will stress it again. These tend to be lone wolf, crazy people, small cells, but rare. They do commit extremely lethal acts, and they tend to be much more efficient than the brick-throwing, bottle-throwing left. I'm not saying that one is worse or better than the other. I'm pointing out they're different, and two things can be true at the same time, that they're both bad. But often we see the mainstream ignore the rising threat from the far left. They often talk about how there's a bigger threat from the far right. By all means, it's fair to point that out. But we can't ignore the mainstreaming of calls for violence and escalation. When Burger King joins the fray and defies a police request because of the escalating tensions, the police are saying, please don't sell this because violence is escalating, and Burger King makes fun of it. They make it a joke. They don't realize that they're on the side that's encouraging the escalation. It's mob mentality. When major brands are jumping up and down and giggling and laughing because they're a part of the mob, you can damn well be sure the escalation will only get worse. And it does. A Greek CNN reporter had their car destroyed by a bomb. Thankfully, the reporter was uninjured. But this is a reporter for CNN whose car was blown up only a few days ago. Why? She believes, because she was reporting on the leader of a far-left group. They didn't like that, so she was targeted. I'll end with this one final thought. This is from Nietzsche. Be aware when fighting monsters, you yourself do not become a monster, for when you gaze long into the abyss gazes also into you. These people believe everyone is a Nazi. They believe that anyone who dare have an opinion is a Nazi. They call liberals Nazis. They put up signs saying that liberals get the bullet. These people have become the monsters. One of the analogies I've often used is that the anti-racist, anti-fascist types are kind of like white blood cells. But when they've destroyed the pathogen, the invader, they continue to attack healthy cells. It's like an autoimmune disorder. There was a period where anti-racist activists and anti-fascist activists were important to actually push back the actual rise of fascism. Today, they just think anybody who believes in free speech is one of these as well. And that's when the white blood cells begin attacking the healthy cells, and it's causing everything to fall apart. It's no surprise to me then that in Australia, we saw another Trump Brexit phenomenon. If you haven't been following, the right was projected to lose for years. They won. What do you think's going to happen come 2020? The left has become fractured, increasingly calling for violence, mocking those who try to simmer down tensions. It is a mob mentality of people with no principle, who simultaneously believe that jokes are violence, speech is violence, but silence is also violence. They both can't be true at the same time. And so long as mainstream outlets like the Huffington Post and YouTube encourage people to push this, things will only get worse. And it ends when Burger King thinks it's funny to join in the fun, laughing haha at the escalation of violence. And then people show up with bricks. People show up with bricks and rocks and bike locks, and it can only lead to one conclusion. I've said often over the past few years that I believe escalation is truly coming, and I'll tell you why. When you have Burger King saying, we're gonna keep selling milkshakes, we understand, they know the joke, they know what's happening. Well, you've got mainstream corporations agreeing on it. When you have people writing articles criticizing conservatives for being upset that people are calling for violence, where do you think things are headed? This is the mainstream left encouraging this behavior. This is YouTubers with large followings, not the biggest following, but being promoted by the mainstream, saying, prepared to get hit. Do you think that the people on the other side are going to sit there and just take the punch, take the brick? No, they're going to show up in force. And of course, the people on the left who are encouraging the escalation just call everybody a Nazi, and they'll escalate right back. I believe it's going to get really bad. But you know what? It's been a long time coming. You know, these things they keep getting worse, but the left doesn't back down. They don't. While I can certainly stress at the end of this, there are fringe right-wing weirdos who do bad things, for sure. But to take those fringe right-wing weirdos and label all conservatives, all free speech advocates, people like George Carlin, saying they deserve to be hit, it's you who's escalating this. It's the left. So when people, again, ask me, why am I so concerned with the left? Well, it's because Steven Crowder, right, high-profile conservative, condemned the violence. Paul Joseph Watson condemned the violence. Who got banned? Steven Crowder was throttled on Facebook. Paul Joseph Watson was banned, yet the people who advocate for violence repeatedly are platformed. CBS television show tells you must enforce Overton's window with violence. Let's go back to the 1960s, when people were just trying to live their lives, but miscegenation laws prevented people who were of mixed race from cohabitating. You can even live together. Would you then call for people to use violence to enforce Overton's window? No. I'll leave it there. Thanks for hanging out. Next video will be coming up at, for those watching on YouTube, it'll be youtube.com/timcast at 6 p.m. But I believe this segment is now going to be the end of the podcast. So for those that are listening on the podcast, thanks for hanging out, and I will see you all next time.